Hi, everybody. Jodi Jensen here, and we're going to do things a little opposite today. Talking about my new book that's out, Children of RaShell. We're going to talk with my editor, Kimberly Rei, about the process of editing the book. So, introduce yourself, Kim.
I'm Kimberly Rei. I am an editor and an author. I've worked with Jodi before on a fabulous project called 13 Drops of Blood, and I was delighted to work with her on this one. Fabulous story.
Yes, thank you. So, let's just jump right in and talk about what was the hardest part for you editing Children of RaShell?
Uh, so it wasn't unique to Children of RaShell. Um, I wouldn't say I struggle with it, but I'm always mindful of keeping the author's voice, especially as an author myself. There's all too often I see something and think of how I would word it. Doesn't mean it's better, doesn't mean it's worse. It's just how I would do it. And keeping that voice out of the story while helping to make it shine um, can be a challenge at times.
Well, and as
So
an
this,
author, man, I appreciate that so much because, to be able to preserve the author's voice like that is such a big thing because it can change the tone of a story if you change the author's voice. So that's huge. That's a big thing.
yeah,
So
and
what,
I don't think a lot of new editors are aware of that kind of
right,
concept.
I
But I've
agree.
been writing long enough that I know my voice and I know other authors' voice. And having worked with you before,
Do you think
you
it
can kind
helped,
of
gave
draw
you
from
an
that.
advantage that you worked with editors on the other side of things as an author? So you're trying to keep your voice preserved as an author. Do you think that kind of gave you an edge on being aware and doing that?
It absolutely does. It's sometimes hard to recognize your voice. I mean, we use that word, we toss that word around a lot, but then when we're asked what it means, we sort of shrug and go, "Well, it is what it is." It really comes home when somebody changes it or changes a part of it, because that will be discordant in your story. You know, you're reading along and suddenly it sounds like a different narrator is talking. So, as an author, having worked with editors who have shifted things up a bit, I became really aware of what it looks like, what it sounds like, and how to avoid it. Yeah.
Right. And I just think that is probably one of the hardest thing for any editor to do in any story is to preserve that voice. So that's a really good point. So what do you think was the easiest part of editing the book?
You write really cleanly, so pretty
Oh,
much everything. Yeah, there
well,
wasn't like a
thank
lot
you.
of grammatical issues. There were a couple of things that got repetitive. I do that.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, I think most authors do. You know, talk to any author and they'll have one or two words or phrases that are just
Mhm.
always a problem. You know,
Right.
um, social media will get on this where characters are nodding all the time or the eyebrows are raising
Yeah.
all the time. So
Yeah.
that's the kind of thing to be aware of. But you write so crisp that it is not a chore.
Oh, thank you. I'm kind of just smiling and laughing a little to myself because I was thinking about how we talked about that my characters like to eat every time they go anywhere or stop and
What,
do
and it's
anything
important to have your rations and your water, and everybody had rations and water
all the
all
time.
the
They were
time. You know,
well fed.
they were well fed and hydrated. It's important. It was hot out there.
It's it just strikes me as a little bit funny because it really is true. Like you do have little quirks every writer does and I have had it mentioned to me before in other works that I do that. So that definitely is a me quirk. So, can you tell
As I'm
us?
nodding and raising my eyebrows.
We all have them. Can you tell us a little bit about your editing process when you sit down to edit?
Yeah. The first thing I do is read the whole story through.
Mhm.
And then I read it through again. And sometimes I give it a third shot. Each time I'm kind of looking for something different to make notes of. So the first time is just to read the story. The second is to be aware of any uh, big developmental issues, things that don't make sense to me, and I may jot down some notes. And the third round is more, it's hard to say what that one's for. If I'm taking a third run at it, it means I'm still not understanding some large parts of the story. Um, And then I get into the grammar. I go through and I do all of the commas and the semicolons and the em dashes and spelling checks.
Those are fun, aren't they?
Yeah, and the house that I mostly work with is Australian.
Mhm.
And sometimes they want it in British English and sometimes they want it in American English.
Right. Right.
And I have the benefit of I started school in England. So I started learning to spell over there. And then in second grade, I came to the States and learned to spell here. So I've got a pretty good grasp on which is which.
Yeah.
But man, there's times it gets confusing.
Yeah, there's a
Um,
learning curve for me in that because I didn't know British English very well at all. So I totally understand the need to know the difference on that one. Yeah.
I've had to refine it a bit because my education was half and half. I will still submit things to this house half and half and get edits back. Like you should know better by now. You've done this enough.
That's funny.
Um, and then once that's done, then I start getting into any developmental issues, any difficulties in flow, changes in tense. A lot of authors change tense and don't even realize it.
Right.
Um, yeah, it's interesting when you get something to edit, whether it's in first person or third person, or I think we were talking about one that was like first person present tense.
Yeah,
That
that's a
can
hard
go,
one.
yeah. I find that what I write in is easier to edit in. So
Yes,
if it's a tense that I
absolutely.
don't usually use, it can get a little hairy. Um, yeah,
I would agree with that when you're writing too. It's just you're so comfortable in the tense that you write in that you don't think about it, and then when you try to write something in a different tense, it's really hard. I think that's why most people tend to stick to the one that they like the most because it can get a little weird, and then your editors are looking at you like you should know how to do this. You're like, but I haven't done this one before. So it
right.
is kind of fun. But yeah, good. Anything else you have to add to that? I think that was okay. So, did you have to fact check anything on my work?
Um, Not fact check. I mean, that's part of the fun of sci-fi, right? Is that you can make stuff up, and as long as
Right.
it has a basis in sounding legitimate, then you can get away with a lot. The only thing that I did research is I don't want to give too much away, but it has to do with what a young body can handle and how much of what you were asking characters to do was viable,
Right.
even in a futuristic setting, because I don't care how tech goes, there's certain things that the body just won't handle. Um, that was pretty much it. Like I said, I mean, you write clean, you research clean. It's clear that you may not be a geneticist, but you know about what you're talking about enough to get through the story.
That's it. Is enough to get through the story. So that's always good because I've come across times myself as both an editor and an author when I have had to fact check and you kind of it does kind of stop you when you're the flow of the story. And so, it's really good. Like as editors, I think that's part of our job is to make sure that we're not interrupting that flow for anything. So, yeah. So, from an editor's viewpoint, excuse me, which character do you think is the most important to the story and why?
Dalton, he's secondary, but he is a solid resource for everybody. He's
Yes.
there. He's people go to him. He goes to make sure everyone's okay. I swear everyone needs a Dalton in their life. He's just
Yeah.
yeah, like I like Arya, I like the kids, I like the characters you're supposed to like. I don't like the ones you're
Yeah.
not supposed to. Um, but Dalton tugged at my heart.
Yeah, he is a good character, and I would agree with you as far as we talked a little bit about this in part one about who my favorite character was. So, but favorite character and most important character are different things, and I would agree Dalton's are just an important character. He's so involved in every stage and every step everyone goes. He's everyone's go-to person, and he has all the information or most of it And I don't know, you're right. Everyone needs a Dalton. That's for sure.
I could use one.
Me too. Let's just make one. Let's make one.
I like this.
So, is this a genre that you're familiar with? And if so, is that as a reader, a writer, an editor, a combination of those?
Combination, very familiar with it. I was a teenager in the 80s, so sci-fi fantasy had a bit of a boom at that point.
Yeah.
And I was reading everything I could get my hands on. Anne McCaffrey, David Weber, some serious space opera, heavy duty sci-fi, some lighter. I've delved into it with writing. I have a novella out there that is sci-fi. Um, but it's not my go-to genre anymore. But I've definitely played in that field. Editing, I haven't done a lot in it. Um, but Children of RaShell it's definitely sci-fi. There's no doubt about that. But it's not the hardcore science. It's not, you're not out on spaceships
Mhm.
with I mean, I mentioned Weber and I love his work, but he'll spend 30 pages telling you about the spaceship.
Right.
So I can't imagine trying to edit that. Um,
Right.
so
No,
I like to stay on the
I
lighter
would say
side
it
for
kind of
sci-fi.
shows that you are familiar with this genre because the feedback that you gave me was really good and specific to things that, when you would question me, is this really possible? Could this really happen? What about this? Does it need to be this way? Like things like that when you're questioning me, that kind of shows that it's at least something you're familiar with, which is really good. It's hard to edit things that are outside of your typical genres.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate hearing that. I have a friend who's in academia and he has sent me articles and I'm like,
I know. You're like, I can tell you where to put the comma, but
right, I can tell you that the first paragraph sounds good.
right.
Past that, I don't know. So yeah, I appreciate that though. I'm glad it came through.
Yeah, I think as editors sometimes you almost have to say, this isn't my typical thing, so, you know, I'll give you what I can, but I don't know. I'm really glad that we were able to match up as author and editor because you did know the genre and it did show in your edits. So that was good. That was really good.
Just stay away from westerns. We'll be good.
I've only done one of those, and it was a zombie western. So
That's
like
even better. That works.
that was a fun story too. Anyway, so as editors, we take a closer look at the story than just about anybody else, aside from the author. So I just wondered, how did this story make you feel once you finished with the edits and it was ready to go?
So I mean, as far as the process, I felt good that it was complete. I didn't feel like I was sending you something that didn't make sense or that wasn't done and that I was just handing it off. How did I feel as a reader about the story and as a human about the story? A little concerned. There's a lot of it that isn't necessarily what we're living through now, but it's around the corner. It's close. Um, I've read some articles that reminded me of Children of RaShell. So again, I don't want to give anything away, but there's some concern for humanity. But you also leave it on a while it's a cliffhanger or two, maybe three. Um, it ends on a note of hope, right? It ends on a note of maybe we can get out of the mess that we're in your world, which is not so far flung from the messes we have in ours. So I think that hope is what drives humanity kind of as a whole without getting on too high of a horse.
Right.
So it was a good way to end it. I've read post-apocalyptic dystopian, I've written that kind of stuff that just leaves you sort of wrung out. And you
Right.
don't do that. You leave it on a high note. So close the book with a smile and wait for the next one. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
Well, yeah, it's coming. And that is the thing about, post-apocalyptic fiction and dystopian stories. I think there's a general overall darkness to these stories, and to be able to leave a little bit of light in there, especially at the end, it does hopefully make people think, okay, so there's still a chance, and that's maybe not a bad thing.
No,
So,
it's a very good thing.
yeah. So, the last thing I have for you is I just wondered if we could talk about any editorial advice that you have for authors out there that are hard at work on their stories and wanting to get published.
So there's a lot of I mean, as an editor, I see it a lot. And as a beta reader, I do a lot of beta reading. And it's sometimes difficult to separate those two. I find myself reaching for keys instead of just like I've taken to beta reading on my phone because on my laptop I'll try and start editing it. And we're not
Yeah,
there yet.
that's a good
Um,
idea.
I think a lot of writers, they write the story, they go, this is done, and they send it off. And it needs a couple of passes. It needs a little bit of cleanup. Um, so I would say the first thing you do is review the call that you're submitting to and make sure you're hitting the theme and you're hitting their requirements. Like if they want it in 12 Times New Roman, don't send it in 14 Comic Sans. That can get
Right.
you booted right off the
It
bat.
it can. It can.
Yeah. I wouldn't read that. So make sure that you're not throwing spaghetti and seeing what sticks at the wall. You're making sure that you're hitting the theme. I don't know how many times I've been beta reading and just my response is not on theme, not on theme. This is a great story. This will totally
Right.
work somewhere else. Um, then go over it. There's all kinds of things out there. There's Pro Writer Plus, I think.
Pro writing aid.
Pro Writing Aid, yeah.
Yes,
There's a free copy out there of that. That'll run through your grammar and your spelling. It doesn't take long. Take a
it
shot.
doesn't. And I use it
Um,
myself. I love Pro Writing Aid because it helps you find your echoes.
yes,
And that's a
yes,
big one. You don't want to use the same word over and over and over and over to describe things, and that will help you find your echoes. I love Pro Writing Aid. I use it myself for writing and editing.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
It's a very, very handy tool. Grammarly's okay. Um, the problem that I think authors have when looking at their own stuff without any kind of a tool or an aid or an outside view is that we read what we expect. We know
right.
what we were reading. I remember showing my ex a story that I'd written, and he started laughing and he goes, "Did you write this late last night?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he goes, "You're missing an entire section. I thought I'd written it." I
Oh,
hadn't. He
oh
had no,
no.
I went from here to here. There was nothing in between.
Oh my gosh.
Um,
You're like,
because
whoops.
right. I knew what I wrote. And when I went back and read it, I guess I sort of filled it in. We
Yeah,
read what we expect. So
right.
these tools that call out things like an echo or a bad phrase or a fragmented sentence are really handy for shining a light on things that we're just going to glaze over.
Right.
Um, one of the best pieces of advice I read, and I wouldn't do this on a novel, I wouldn't do it on anything past like a short story, but to read it backwards. um, because then you're not reading and you're not expecting what comes next. You
Right.
are looking at each word, and it's
Right.
going to jump out at you if you're nodding too much, if you're rationing too much, if you have too
Right.
much water. Um, there was a story that I edited that had way too many instances of the word had.
Mhm.
You know, you back and you read these things backwards, it sort of stands out.
Right.
And then read it out loud to somebody, to your cat, to your dog, to nobody, to the mirror, but read it out loud
Right.
because again, you'll start to hear those things.
Yeah.
And you'll start to hear staccato, right? If your sentences all have 5 words, or if your sentences are all long, sweeping operas, you
Right.
need to break it up for your reader. So if you read it out loud, you'll get that flow.
Right.
Um,
That is another thing that I do too, is I read it out loud, but I actually use the read aloud feature on Word. And I do
okay,
this for a specific reason. It's because I want to follow along and I'm a really fast reader, so I purposely make it read slow so that I am forced to stop and like slow down and look at every word as it reads it.
yep,
And that
yeah,
helps me find missing words, or if you have the word peak, which should be P-E-E-K and it's P-E-A-K, you'll notice it, you'll see it. Where Word might not catch it or Pro Writing Aid might not catch it, but your eye will see it. So,
that's
and
great.
it's
That is
weird to hear the computer voice read. It doesn't give the inflection as far as the dialogue goes. It doesn't read emotions into things, but it's really handy as far as forcing your eyes to follow along.
Right.
So to do it at a
Yeah, I like
different
that.
speed than what you read at, either faster or slower, but a different speed than what you normally read at.
And that totally gets around the reading what you expect too. Is something
Right,
else
it
reading it. I
does.
like that. Yeah,
It
I will
does.
have to try that. It's good
Yeah.
advice.
Yeah, this is why we share advice because there's so many good, useful tools for people that, helps you get your work into a tighter, better position when you're submitting, you know?
Yeah. Well, and so much of this is solitary writing, reading, editing. It's all like just you and the page. So to be able to have conversations and share tips and tricks is really important.
Yeah. Somebody told me years ago, I had mentored with an author who was published 5 times internationally. She'd won some awards. She was a retired English professor, and I mentored with her for a couple of years. And the very best piece of advice that she gave me, and I've always remembered this and I always think about it, is thou shalt never ever kick thy reader out of thy story. And basically,
Yes.
what that means is like, whatever you're doing, if you're going to break rules, break rules. If you're going to do something different, do something different. But don't kick your reader out of your story. Don't lose the flow of the story because you lose your reader and they put the book down and walk away and they might not pick it up again. So,
Yep.
whatever
And
you're doing, yeah.
they're gonna remember your name
Mm-hmm.
poorly. They're gonna
Right.
remember, oh, I tried reading her book and I couldn't get through it.
Right. And instead you want
Yeah.
them turning those pages, So as writers and as editors, I think if we think about it that way and approach our stories in that way, it makes it easier to cut the fluff, that we don't need because you realize that does kick a reader out of the story and you don't want to do that ever.
Yeah. Yeah. I recently worked on a piece that had the phrase that I'd heard was author intrusion. And
Hmm.
it's almost like a side note. I don't know if you've seen House of Cards, but where the main character turns and starts talking to the camera.
Oh
And
yeah.
it works in the show, but it doesn't work in like a
Right.
short story. Like you can't
Right.
just, and by the way, that means, and then 5 paragraphs
Right.
explaining a phrase.
Right.
I
Like
mean, it's
meanwhile back on the ranch, kind
exactly, exactly.
of. Right.
Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that.
No, no, definitely don't do that. I don't know. And as we're sitting here talking, I'm thinking of some of the other things I do as an editor that help me as a writer. I have a spreadsheet I use that I can check my manuscript before I make my first editing pass. I can check it for all of those pesky little filter words, that we use. I can check it for instances of really commonly used words like smile or looked or things like that because there's so many ways to say those things. You don't need to use the same word all the time. And and then you can go through your manuscript and reduce those and then look again and put the number in and compare and see where you're at. And that is a really useful tool for me because I'm really visual. So if I can see that number getting smaller, then I know I'm making progress and I know that I'm so that's a tool that I use for myself is to help me keep track of not overusing words and phrases.
There's another tool that I use, mostly for things like Drabbles that you have to have 100 words, but wordcounter.net.
Mm,
Again, it's free, and it gives you on the side, it'll give you, you've used this word this many times, this
yeah,
word this many times, and it starts at the most and then brings it down.
yeah.
And I have found that that's been very helpful with much longer pieces. I'll copy and paste it in there and then see that I have nodded 87 times.
Does that have
I
a
mean,
word
it's
limit
awesome.
of how much you can put in? No?
I have yet to find it. If they do, I
Oh,
haven't found it. And the really nice thing about it is that if you close the tab, the next time you open it, whatever you had in there last will still be there, which
interesting.
has saved me sometimes when I've overwritten stories.
Right? And you're like, oh wait, I know where I can find this. That's awesome.
Yes.
And see,
And it works. It's,
I've heard of that one, but I haven't used it. I'm gonna have to check that out.
yeah, and it's different instances. So what you do on the desktop and on the laptop and on the phone are different. So if you have different
Right.
stories in there, those
Right.
three will still be there.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. That's
Yeah.
cool.
I like it a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. One of the other things I always tell, authors when I'm talking to other authors about their work and about how to find a good match with editors or beta readers or even just critique groups and people that are sharing their work and giving each other advice is to try to find people that are close to the same level where you are. Because if you find somebody who is not as far along in their writer's journey, they're gonna be eager to work with you, obviously, but they're gonna give you advice that's maybe not quite as good as somebody because they don't know. And so,
Right.
we want to mentor and we want to help and we want to teach and we want to, get them to that level where they want to be. But if you're comparing work and you're in a critique group, you want to find people that are close to the same level as you because then you get the feedback that you need.
Yeah.
I feel like. And that can be a
Yeah.
little tricky. So it kind of means putting yourself out there, talking to people, finding out kind of where they're at, reading samples of each other's work, stuff like that really is helpful. And
It can be intimidating. I mean, it comes back to the whole this is a solitary thing, but it doesn't
yeah,
have to be, and in certain ways it shouldn't be. Joining groups online. Before I was ever published, I was in a couple of writing groups on Facebook, and we would do these prompts and these, throw something out there and get critiques back. And you're right, you can tell who's new at this,
right.
and you can tell who is stuffed so far up their own work that
Right.
they
Right.
can't see anybody else's. So
Yeah.
you also have to filter that out, right? There's a process of taking what works and taking what doesn't work and
Right.
tossing what doesn't work. Like you said, if you're going to break rules, you got to know the rules.
Yeah.
Um, but not everybody that is prolific in this field has good advice,
Right. That's
and
true.
not all advice will work for you.
Right.
So it's part of the learning process is to figure out what works,
Yeah.
what doesn't, and what you have to keep even if you don't like it. There's parts of this that I don't like,
Right.
but that's the industry, that's the way it works, that's the way the stories work.
Right. Well, and
Yeah.
I think there's an art to giving good feedback. And when I say that, it's because I've had editors before where they give you feedback and they're critical, which is okay, but in a way that comes across as being short with you and being, not patient, not taking it as an opportunity to teach you something. And I understand that as authors, when you're have an editor, there's an expectation that you kind of know what you're doing and that they kind of know what they're doing too. And you're going to meet in the middle and make this story of yours this wonderful thing. But there's an art to giving good feedback, and when you're an author it can be really hard to take if the feedback isn't given in a kind way. And I say that because I've experienced that myself, to have gotten feedback that wasn't very nice. And I will say, the feedback I got from you, even pointing out things that I was like kind of chuckled about, like how they eat every time they stop, it was true, but it was critique and feedback that was given in a nice way. And I think, you know, as authors, we're more ready to accept it if it's done in that way. And I think it's really important to be careful how you give feedback to people, don't you think?
I do. I think that there's never a reason for an editor to be unkind.
Right.
Ever. I don't care how bad it is. And I've seen some stuff that I'm like, how did this get accepted? Um, there's never a reason to be unkind or cruel or mean. And anybody who does, I think, is feeding their own ego and trying to show off that I know better. And it often comes across as pretentious. You asked about the process, and there's something that I try and do with every story, and that is to layer. So this is a problem or this is a pain point,
Mhm.
but this made me laugh. This made me smile. This is a really good turn of phrase. You
Right.
made this part shine. And lean on that, maybe even a little bit more. Don't Pollyanna it, don't lie, don't fake it.
Right.
But like when my wife is reading something and she'll laugh, I always ask her, what made you laugh? Not for a pat on the back. I'm not fishing for compliments. I need to know what turn of phrase pulled an emotion out.
Right. What's
And as an
working?
editor, right, as an editor, I think it's important to let authors know that it's
Absolutely.
especially when you're facing a wall of red
Yeah,
and you just like,
absolutely.
and that wall of red could be the simplest thing. It just happens
Yeah.
over and over, but it'll
Right.
take the legs right out from under you. So
Right,
if you reinforce that, if you shore that up with compliments, and kindness, and just be professional about things.
right. And you make a really good point when you say that it's important to tell the authors what's working. And yeah, it even is a little bit of a pat on the back, but more importantly, it lets the author know I evoked this emotion here. This is good. And like you said, that's important. We need to know that because that's what we want to keep doing. Like that's the heart of the story right there when you can evoke emotion in your reader. So
Yeah, and
definitely that's probably the best advice about editing is to not forget to add in those things you like and the compliments and the good stuff too. Make sure you're letting the author know about
it
that.
doesn't always have to be. I mean, we say the good stuff when we say compliments, but especially in the genres you and I dabble in, the
Yeah.
horror, the dark, the more dystopian or apocalyptic.
Yeah.
Sometimes that good, you made me cry, or you made
Yeah.
me angry.
Yeah, you evoke this
So,
emotion.
right, it shouldn't always be, oh no, this made me smile and it was wonderful.
Right.
You
No.
tell the author what works,
Yes.
and sometimes why it works. I
Yes.
got angry because I didn't like this character. In fact, I think I said that on yours.
You
Like,
did.
I don't like this character.
Right.
And I'm not supposed to. Not
Right.
not I don't like it because he's flat or because he's unbelievable. No, I think that this guy needs to be dragged to the town square and beaten because that's the character,
Right.
right?
Right.
So that tells you you're doing the right thing. You've got the right tone for this guy.
Right. Right. And that is good to know because you don't always know if what you're doing with different characters works. And even small characters can serve a big purpose in just having the personality that they have so that their interaction with a character becomes part of that character's experience.
Yes.
And so it matters that you get those details right. So absolutely. Well, this has been a really fun conversation. Thank you so much. We're actually
Thank
about out
you.
of time, so I think we'll wrap it up. But anything in closing that you want to say?
Write to your heart's content. I mean, write it, and if you think it's tidy, send it off. Editors are here to make it shine.
Yeah. Yep. And for me, if you haven't yet, Children of RaShell came out yesterday. It's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Smashwords, Kobo, anywhere online that you can think of. It's probably there. So check it out and let me know what you think. So thank you.
Bye.